When Marcus Williams looked in the mirror, what he saw could have made Sarah run away. The metal wires running from his left temple to his chin, his sunken eye, his asymmetrical face. A normal person would flee from this sight. Marcus smiled, because this scar was the story of his heroism. And today, Sarah, the love of his life, would face this reality. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we continue this story of love, courage, and the indomitable human spirit, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. If you want to see the power of true love and courage, hit that subscribe button and help us share these stories that matter. 3 weeks ago, Marcus Williams was living the happiest days of his life. His perfect 12-year career as an Army Special Forces sergeant. His fiancée, Sarah Mitchell, whom he would marry in 3 months. And the dream of the family life they would build when he returned from Afghanistan. Everything was perfect. Sarah was a 28-year-old woman working as a nurse at the local hospital, and she was one of the rare people who loved Marcus in his civilian clothes. 3 weeks before his final rotation, Marcus had sent Sarah a special message. "This is the last mission, baby. When I come back, nothing will be able to separate us. I'm going to marry you with what I love most in the world, an intact man." 2 days after that message, everything changed. The convoy rolled through the dusty streets of Kandahar as the sun began to set behind the mountains. Marcus Williams sat in the back of the armored vehicle, checking his M4 rifle for the 3rd time that evening. Something felt wrong. In 12 years of Special Forces operations, he'd learned to trust that feeling. Team leader Jake Morrison was studying satellite images on his tablet. "Intelligence says this should be clean," he said, not looking up. "Arms dealer, minimal security, in and out." Marcus adjusted his night vision goggles and checked his sidearm. That's what they said about the last 3 operations that went sideways. Medic Tommy Rodriguez was organizing his medical kit with methodical precision. "You always worry too much, Marcus. Remember Helmand Province? You were sure that was a trap, too." "And it was," Marcus replied. "We just got lucky." Machine gunner Danny Foster loaded a fresh belt into his weapon. "Luck is what we make it. Besides, this is supposed to be your last operation before going home to that pretty fiancée of yours." Marcus smiled at the mention of Sarah. 3 more weeks and he'd be on a plane home. 3 more weeks and he could put the ring on her finger and never look back. The convoy stopped 2 kilometers from the target village. The 4-man team dismounted and began their approach on foot. The intelligence briefing had been specific. A known arms smuggler named Khalid was storing weapons in a compound on the village's eastern edge. Simple reconnaissance and seizure operation. But as they moved through the outer buildings, Marcus's unease grew stronger. The village was too quiet. No dogs barking, no children playing, no usual sounds of evening life. Even the electrical grid seemed deliberately dimmed. "Jake," Marcus whispered into his radio, "this doesn't feel right. Where is everyone?" Jake held up his hand, signaling the team to stop. They crouched behind a low stone wall, scanning the buildings ahead. The target compound was visible 200 meters away, a 2-story structure with a walled courtyard. "Maybe they evacuated for the night," Tommy suggested quietly. "Or maybe someone told them we were coming," Marcus replied, his finger moving to his trigger guard. They waited for 10 minutes, watching, listening. The only movement was a loose piece of metal sheeting flapping in the evening breeze. Finally, Jake made the decision. "We proceed as planned. Danny, you take overwatch from that rooftop. Marcus, you and Tommy follow me to the compound. Maintain radio silence unless you see immediate threat." Danny moved to position while the other three advanced. Marcus kept his rifle at the ready, eyes scanning windows and doorways. The feeling in his gut was screaming now, but orders were orders. They reached the compound wall without incident. Jake signaled for Marcus to cover while he and Tommy breached the courtyard gate. The metal hinges creaked as it swung open, the sound echoing off nearby buildings. The courtyard was empty, except for an old pickup truck and some scattered equipment. Jake motioned for Tommy to check the vehicle while he and Marcus approached the main building. That's when Marcus saw it. A curtain in a second-story window across the street moved just slightly. Not from wind, from someone pulling it back to look. "Contact," Marcus whispered urgently into his radio, but his words were drowned out by the eruption of gunfire. The ambush began with devastating precision. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different buildings simultaneously. AK-47 fire raked the courtyard, bullets sparking off stone walls and metal surfaces. The distinctive crack snap of rounds passing close to their heads filled the air. Tommy was hit in the first volley. The bullet caught him in the right thigh, shattering his femur and dropping him behind the pickup truck. His scream of pain was lost in the chaos of automatic weapons fire. "Ambush! Ambush!" Jake shouted into his radio as he dove for cover behind a concrete planter. Marcus sprinted across the courtyard, tracer rounds lighting up the darkness around him like deadly fireflies. He reached Tommy just as a second burst of fire peppered the ground where the medic had fallen. "How bad?" Marcus yelled over the gunfire, dragging Tommy behind the truck's engine block. "Bones shattered," Tommy gasped, applying pressure to his wound. "But I can still fight." From his overwatch position, Danny's machine gun began returning fire, the heavy weapon chattering in controlled bursts. But the enemy had chosen their positions well. They had overlapping fields of fire and solid cover. Marcus assessed the situation rapidly. They were pinned down in a kill zone with limited cover, facing an unknown number of enemy fighters who had clearly been expecting them. The compound they'd come to search was now a trap. "Jake, we need to move," Marcus called out. "They've got us zeroed." "Where?" Jake replied, reloading his rifle. "They've got every exit covered." A rocket-propelled grenade whooshed overhead, detonating against the compound's outer wall in a shower of concrete and dust. The explosion left Marcus's ears ringing and filled the air with choking debris. "Danny, can you see muzzle flashes?" Marcus radioed to their overwatch. "I count at least 8 shooters," Danny responded between bursts of return fire. 2 in the building directly across from you, 3 in the structure to your north, and more in the building to your east. They've got machine gun positions set up. Marcus felt his shoulder burn as a bullet grazed his body armor. The impact spun him around, but didn't penetrate. He returned fire through a gap in the truck's chassis, watching his tracers disappear into a second-story window. The firefight had been raging for 10 minutes when Marcus made a critical decision. Tommy was losing blood despite the tourniquet, and their ammunition was running low. Someone had to break the stalemate. "I'm going to flank left," Marcus told Jake. "Draw their fire away from Tommy." "Negative," Jake replied immediately. "Too risky. We wait for air support." But Marcus was already moving. He sprinted from behind the truck toward a low wall on the compound's western side, using the darkness and his own muzzle flashes to mask his movement. Enemy fire followed him, bullets chipping stone and kicking up dirt around his feet. He made it to the wall, just as a PKM machine gun opened up from the building to his north. The heavy weapons rounds punched through the stone barrier like it was cardboard, forcing Marcus to roll away from his cover. That's when he saw the sniper's muzzle flash. The shot came from a rooftop 150 meters away, invisible in the darkness until that split second of flame. Marcus was moving when the bullet found him, the 7.62mm round entering just in front of his left ear and traveling through his jaw before exiting below his cheek. The impact was like being hit by a sledgehammer. Marcus's world exploded in pain and confusion as the bullet shattered his jawbone and severed nerves on the left side of his face. He collapsed behind a pile of rubble, blood filling his mouth and running down his neck. But he was still conscious. Through the ringing in his ears, Marcus could hear Jake screaming into the radio. "Man down! Man down! Marcus is hit!" The world spun around him, but Marcus forced himself to focus. He could feel the hole in his face, could taste copper and bone fragments, but he was alive. And Tommy was still pinned down with a shattered leg. Marcus keyed his radio with trembling fingers. Still here," he managed to say through his ruined jaw. Get Tommy out." For the next 15 minutes, Marcus lay behind the rubble pile while the firefight raged around him. Blood loss was making him dizzy, and the pain in his face was beyond description. But every time he started to lose consciousness, he thought about Sarah, about the wedding they'd planned, about the promise he'd made to come home whole. He wasn't whole anymore, but he was still coming home. Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "Apache inbound, 2 minutes." The sound of rotor blades grew louder, and suddenly the distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter gunships filled the air. The AH-64 Apaches appeared like mechanical angels, their 30mm chain guns lighting up the night as they engaged the enemy positions. The effect was immediate and devastating. The buildings that had sheltered the ambushers erupted in explosions of concrete and flame. Enemy fire slackened and then stopped entirely as the surviving fighters fled or were eliminated. When the Apaches finished their gun runs, an eerie quiet settled over the village. Marcus could hear Jake and Danny calling his name, but he couldn't respond clearly anymore. His jaw wouldn't work properly, and he was fading in and out of consciousness. The last thing he remembered before the medevac helicopter arrived was looking up at the stars through the smoke and dust, thinking that Sarah would never have to see him like this. He'd make sure of that. Marcus woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed at Bagram Air Base. The first thing he tried to do was speak, but only a mumbled groan came out. His jaw was wired shut, and the left side of his face was covered in bandages. A doctor appeared at his bedside, a tired-looking man in his 50s with kind eyes. "Sergeant Williams, I'm Dr. Peterson. You've been unconscious for 72 hours. You're stable, but we need to talk about your injuries." Marcus tried to nod, sending shooting pains through his skull. "The bullet did significant damage to your jawbone and facial nerves," Dr. Peterson continued. "We've done what we can here, but you're going to need multiple reconstructive surgeries. We're flying you to Walter Reed in Germany first, then on to Washington." Over the next week, as Marcus was transported from Bagram to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, and finally to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, he had plenty of time to think. The morphine helped with the pain, but couldn't touch the growing dread in his chest. How could he face Sarah like this? How could he ask her to marry a man whose face was held together with metal plates and wire? The engagement ring he'd been carrying in his pocket seemed to mock him now. At Walter Reed, the extent of his injuries became clear. The bullet had shattered his left cheekbone, fractured his jaw in 3 places, and severed several facial nerves. He would need at least 6 months of surgeries and rehabilitation. And even then, Dr. Martinez explained, his face would never look the same. "The good news is that we can restore most of your functionality," she said during one of their consultations. "You'll be able to eat, speak normally, and have full range of motion. The scarring will be significant, but you'll have a normal life." A normal life. Marcus wasn't sure what that meant anymore. The worst part was the mirrors, or rather, the lack of them. Marcus noticed that all the mirrors in his hospital room had been removed or covered. When he asked about it, Nurse Linda, a middle-aged woman with a motherly demeanor, explained gently that it was standard procedure. Some patients find it disturbing to see themselves during the initial healing process, she said. It's better to wait until the swelling goes down and the sutures are removed. But Marcus needed to see. He needed to know what Sarah would be looking at when she visited, because despite his fears, he couldn't ask her to stay away forever. For 2 weeks, Marcus searched for any reflective surface in his room. The television screen when it was off, the metal surface of his water pitcher, even the polished floor in certain lighting. But none of them gave him a clear picture of the damage. Finally, he convinced an orderly to smuggle him a small, compact mirror. When Marcus first saw his reflection, the image shocked him even though he'd been preparing for it. The left side of his face was a patchwork of stitches and bruising. His eye socket had changed shape, giving him a lopsided appearance. Metal surgical plates were visible beneath the skin at his temple. But what struck him most wasn't the physical damage. It was the look in his own eyes. They were the same eyes that had looked at Sarah with love, that had scanned hostile territory in Afghanistan, that had watched over his teammates during countless missions. The damage was extensive, but the man behind those eyes was still there. That afternoon, Sarah arrived for her first visit. Marcus had been dreading this moment for weeks, but when the door opened and she walked in, all his practiced speeches vanished. Sarah had flown from their hometown in Colorado, traveling for over 20 hours to reach him. She looked exhausted, but determined. When their eyes met, Sarah's composure finally broke. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face, as she took in the full extent of his injuries. "Marcus," she whispered. Marcus pulled out the compact mirror he'd been hiding under his pillow. Looking at his reflection, he saw what she was seeing: the metal plates, the asymmetrical features, the surgical scars that would never fully fade. "This is what I look like now," he said, his speech still slightly slurred from the jaw reconstruction. "I understand if this isn't what you signed up for." Sarah stepped closer to the bed, her eyes never leaving his face. "You can find someone else," Marcus continued, the words cutting him like knives. "Someone whole, someone who looks like the man you fell in love with." Sarah reached out and took the mirror from his hands. Instead of setting it aside, she held it so they could both see their reflections together. "I'm looking at this face," she said softly, "and I see the man who saved Tommy's life. I see the man who served his country with honor. I see the man who faced gunfire to protect his teammates." She turned to look directly at him, the mirror forgotten. "This face tells the story of your courage, Marcus. These scars are proof that you came home to me when you could have died in that village. How could I see anything but beauty in that?" Marcus felt tears running down his cheeks, the first time he'd cried since waking up in the hospital. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This is permanent, Sarah. This is who I am now." Sarah picked up the mirror again and held it between them. "Look in this mirror, Marcus. Do you see a victim, or do you see a hero?" Marcus looked at their reflection, his damaged but healing face next to her beautiful, loving features. For the first time since his injury, he saw something other than loss. "I see a man who survived," he said. "I see a man I want to marry," Sarah replied. 6 months later, they held their wedding in Walter Reed's chapel. Marcus's scars were still visible, but his smile was radiant as he watched Sarah walk down the aisle. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah kissed him gently on his scarred cheek. The rehabilitation process was long and difficult. Marcus had to relearn how to eat solid foods, and his speech therapy took months. But with Sarah by his side, every small victory felt monumental. She attended every appointment, celebrated every milestone, and never once made him feel like a burden. When Marcus was finally discharged from the hospital, they returned to Colorado to start their new life together. Marcus found work training security personnel, using his military experience in a civilian context. The job didn't require him to be the face of the organization, which suited him fine. But something unexpected happened as the months passed. Marcus discovered that his scars, rather than being sources of shame, became conversation starters. Children would ask about them with innocent curiosity, and he found himself sharing simplified versions of his story. Adults who thanked him for his service seemed to understand that his visible wounds represented sacrifices they couldn't see on other veterans. 5 years later, Marcus and Sarah were living in a house outside Denver with their 3 children. Jake, named after his team leader, Tommy, named after the medic whose life he'd saved, and little Sarah, who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination. Every morning, Marcus looked in the bathroom mirror as he got ready for work. The scars were still there, faded but permanent. The asymmetry in his face remained, and probably always would. But the man looking back at him was different from the one who'd first seen those injuries. This was a man who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. A man who'd discovered that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other every day. A man who'd found that his worth wasn't determined by his appearance, but by his character and his actions. Sarah would often join him at the mirror in the mornings, checking her own reflection while he shaved around his scars. Sometimes their eyes would meet in the glass, and they'd share a smile that spoke of everything they'd overcome together. "Still see a hero?" Marcus would ask sometimes. "Every single day," Sarah would reply. One morning, as Marcus was getting ready for work, 5-year-old Jake wandered into the bathroom. The boy had inherited his father's serious nature and was always full of questions. "Daddy, why does your face look different from other daddies?" Jake asked with the direct honesty of childhood. Marcus knelt down to his son's level, bringing them both into view of the mirror. "A long time ago, before you were born, Daddy was a soldier," Marcus explained. "I got hurt protecting my friends, and these marks are from where I was healing." Jake studied his father's reflection thoughtfully. "Did it hurt?" "Yes, it hurt a lot," Marcus said honestly. "But something good came from it too." "What good thing?" Marcus smiled, thinking of all the moments that had led to this one. The terrifying firefight, the long recovery, Sarah's unwavering love, and the family they'd built together. The good thing was learning that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right, even when you are scared. And sometimes, the things that seem terrible at first turn out to teach us the most important lessons. Jake nodded seriously, then reached up to trace one of the scars on his father's cheek with a gentle finger. "I think your face looks like a hero's face, Daddy." That evening, after the children were in bed, Marcus and Sarah sat on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple. Marcus still carried the engagement ring he'd been unable to give her during his deployment, not because their marriage was incomplete, but because it had become a symbol of promises kept, despite impossible odds. "Do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if I hadn't been injured?" Marcus asked, a question that sometimes surfaced during quiet moments. Sarah considered this, watching their youngest daughter's toys scattered across the yard. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I think about everything we've learned, everything we've overcome together. I think about the way you talk to other veterans now, the way you help families going through similar situations. I think about the way our children see courage and resilience as normal parts of life. She turned to look at him, the setting sun highlighting both the smooth and scarred sides of his face. I think we became exactly who we were meant to be, she said. All of us, including these scars. Marcus reached for her hand, their wedding rings catching the last light of day. I used to think those scars were the end of my story, he said. Now I know they were just the beginning of a better one. As darkness settled over their home, Marcus and Sarah went inside to check on their sleeping children. In each bedroom, they paused to watch the peaceful faces of Jake, Tommy, and little Sarah. 3 lives that might never have existed if not for a bullet's path through a village in Afghanistan and a woman's decision to love without conditions. The mirror in their bedroom reflected 2 people who had chosen each other not despite their imperfections, but because of their commitment to face those imperfections together. It showed a man whose scars told a story of service and survival, and a woman whose love had proven that the heart sees beauty where others might see only damage. And in that reflection, they saw not what was lost, but everything that had been found. Now I ask you, have you ever known someone like Sarah, who stood by you in difficult times and looked at character rather than appearance? Or someone who managed to be brave like Marcus, finding strength in their darkest moments? Share their stories in the comments because at Human Stories, we believe that true love and courage can overcome any difficulty. If this story touched you, hit that like button to help us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest videos about love, courage, and the power of the human spirit. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one with stories that remind us that true love looks not at scars, but at the heart, and that sometimes our greatest wounds become the source of our greatest strength.